You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious? I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this bonus content episode for November 7th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran, and I'm very excited for this episode. So those that know our lovely editor-in-chief, Dave Giannini, he joined me on the main show this last week in episode 559, and he talked about this adventure that he's going on right now because, as some of you may know, he currently resides in good old Lexington, Kentucky, my old stomping grounds. And he noted that the Kentucky Theater, the local indie theater there in Lexington, is doing an Andrei Tarkovsky series, playing all of his movies. And Dave wanted to go and check all of them out. So he is doing that, and he's going to write about all of them on the website at InSessionFilm.com. However, Dave went one step further. Not only is he going to see all of the films, he's going to write about all of them on the website, but he also reached out to a lovely gentleman that is going to be doing a bunch of Q&As for the Tarkovsky series. And that is one Raymond Luca, who is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, emphasizing in Russian studies. And he is joining me for this conversation. We're going to talk about Andrei Tarkovsky. So, Raymond, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's very exciting.
Absolutely. So glad to have you here. I'm thrilled that you're getting to do this at the Kentucky Theater, a place that holds a special place in my heart. It's been a minute since I've been to the Kentucky Theater, but when I was living in Lexington, it was my home away from home. So this is very exciting. I'm a bit envious that I cannot be there to experience this with you and Dave. But this is very cool, and I'm glad that you're joining me to talk about Andrei Tarkovsky. Longtime listeners of the show may know this. If you're a new listener, you can certainly go and check out the catalog, the back catalog that is, because we did do an Andrei Tarkovsky series back in 2016, I believe it is. And it was honestly one of the most rewarding series that we've ever done. Loved getting to do that. So now getting to revisit Tarkovsky through this conversation, I'm very excited about. Raymond, tell me about your background, your experience with Andrei Tarkovsky. What do you think about him as a filmmaker overall?
Sure. So like you said, so I'm working at the University of Kentucky. I teach Russian and also film studies. And I got into Russian studies when I was in college. I was an undergrad. I was studying Russian language, studying history, and I had an opportunity to study abroad there. And I did not know I was going to my life was going to go in this direction.
Sure.
But after a semester abroad in St. Petersburg, I was like, all right, I think, I want to see where this goes. And I wanted to make it a big part of my personal and professional life going forward. And then that took me to a film course on Tarkovsky. So I was doing a summer program at Middlebury College up in Vermont. And it's a Russian immersion program, and they have different thematic courses. And one of them, this was probably, in fact, in 2016. So maybe around the time that when you were doing your series.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So not that long ago. And there was a class on Tarkovsky, and we watched all 7 of his movies in conversation with some other major Soviet and Russian directors. And then after that, I was completely confused and beguiled and enchanted and frustrated. And I really, really wanted, I had no idea what was going on in Tarkovsky's movies. And so I really wanted to understand. And shortly after that experience, I began graduate school, where I was pursuing my PhD. And I was intended to focus on Russian and Soviet film with an emphasis on Tarkovsky. And that was what I did. 6 years in graduate school writing a PhD. Now I'm at University of Kentucky teaching classes on Soviet film and Tarkovsky and collaborating with the Kentucky Theater on this film series.
Nice.
So I think Tarkovsky, I think many people who watch him for the first time have an experience similar to mine in that he really, I think, expands people's idea of what you can do with movies.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think people have, if you're watching Tarkovsky, you already have some sort of interest or love for movies, and then you turn him on, and I think it completely blows open the horizon about what's possible through this medium.
Sure.
Um, and he gives you no answers, but lots and lots of questions. But he's a wonderful
Mhm.
catalyst to dive into film history, film theory, and so I think he's an entrance for people to thinking about film seriously. I think often.
Sure. Yeah, no, I very much do agree with that. I certainly don't have the historical context as you do when it comes to Russian cinema or Andrei Tarkovsky, but I did go into his films blind. I had a vague idea of what I was going into simply because of the reputation of Andrei Tarkovsky. But yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what to experience. But as I noted, I found it awfully rewarding because he is a filmmaker that relishes in ambiguity. As you talked about, he loves to provoke questions about not just the human experience, but our place in the universe, even.
Yeah.
And I love the existential qualities that come with his films. They're often very spellbinding, especially because he's not just a provocateur for the sake of it. His films are very thoughtful and analytical, but I find them also incredibly arresting because he puts as much emphasis into his craft, the way he uses the camera, the editing of his films, the production design of them, the cinematography, where and how he uses color is so fascinating. The performances he gets from his actors, the craft of his films is just as mesmerizing. You could simply talk about his movies just from a craft point of view, and we could have an entire thesis written on that alone, let alone all of the themes and the thoughtful analysis that could go into it as well. And that to me is what makes him such a lavish filmmaker. We'll certainly get into these films, and I'm curious to hear you talk about not just what you think of the movies and what Tarkovsky brings to them, but maybe the historical context you can bring to it all as well. I will say this, and we'll get into it, but one of these films is among my top 20 movies of all time. I think it's quite great. But all of these films, and here's the the fascinating thing about it is you could pick any one of these out of a hat and also claim that it's one of the best movies of all time.
Yeah.
Or you could claim that about all of them, really. They're all so vivid and stimulating, and and I love him. Absolutely love him. He will, to your point though, as you're perhaps delving into cinema in a new or a more thoughtful, and I hate to say it this way because it sounds pretentious, but in a more serious manner, if you're delving into that world a little bit more, obviously Tarkovsky is a name that is going to come up, and his films will not be for everybody because of it. They're very dense. They're often methodical and patient. And I am a huge fan of methodical cinema. So that certainly is probably why he resonates so deeply with me. But that won't be for everybody, and that's certainly understandable. But I am curious to dive more into this. Shall we just go through these one by one? Let's start off with Ivan's Childhood,
Yeah, please.
1962. What do you think about that movie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just so this was the first film. So we're going in order with our retrospective at the Kentucky, and this was the first film that we showed. It's his debut. I mean, it's a war film. It's pacifist in essence, so it's a war film that is an anti-war film, right? And at least with kind of the historical context is he makes this film in the early 1960s, which is kind of this moment of the Soviet New Wave, and Stalin has died, who's the authoritarian figure who rules Russia for the better part of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And after Stalin's death, there's a kind of liberalization that happens in Soviet culture that allows for this more poetic, aesthetically experimental cinema. And Ivan's Childhood is kind of peak post-Stalinist cinema of directors kind of having a bit more freedom about the themes they can explore and how they can explore it. So what you were talking about, the craft.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Ivan's Childhood. I think that there's a wonderful performance by the main actor. His name's Nikolai Burlayev. He kind of has which we can talk about maybe later in the podcast, kind of like the afterlife of Tarkovsky and his cinema, how it's being received in Russia today. He has a kind of unseemly trajectory of where he goes. But in this movie, when he's a young kid, I think he has a great role. He does it really well. And I think this film, Tarkovsky ended up not liking this film. In fact, he used to call it his student project. And it isn't.
What?
But I think it does tee you up for all of the motifs that he sustains throughout the rest of his 6 films about the role of dreams, memory, things as small as the visual motif of bitten apples, horses, dead trees, childhood as a stage of kind of like untainted innocence. All of this stuff continually is played out over Tarkovsky's films. And so I sometimes try to think about Tarkovsky as it's kind of one big film with these kind of vague boundaries between each movie. And Ivan's Childhood is the primer for all of that.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. I did not know that Tarkovsky did not like this film all that much, or that he saw this as a student project.
Yeah.
And look, if he was here today, I would have to simply disagree with him. like, I love you, Andrei, but we're going to have to fight here, because this is the film I was referring to. This is far and away my favorite of his. And I think this is one of the best films ever made. Now, it might not carry the sophistication of some of his latter films, and we can certainly get into that as well. When we talked about him here on the show, I do think at times some of his other movies, I think, suffer because of that sophistication. They're still great movies, but comparatively, there's a seamlessness to Ivan's Childhood that I much prefer. And I think what is so resonant to me about Ivan's Childhood, it's really a couple of things. One of it is, and again, I will butcher the name. You can certainly help me out here, but Nikolai Burlayev.
Yeah, perfect.
His performance, I think, is among the best I've ever seen in terms of child performances. It's so incredibly mature and skillful for a young actor, because Ivan is a character who outwardly is 12 years old or whatever he is. He's still rather young, but emotionally, he's much more experienced because of the circumstances around him. And Burlayev displays that with profound confidence and this blistering pathos that I just find so immersive. And thematically speaking, while it does have some vagueness to it, as you're alluding to, and again, it might not have the same sophistication as some of his later movies, but as far as exploring this idea of lost innocence amongst the chaos and the brutality of war, I do find that really heartbreaking here, especially because there's this underlying current of fatherhood throughout the film. Ivan is orphaned. We never really see his biological father, but he joins this army unit as a scout for recon, and the men of that unit grow fond of him and become almost surrogate fathers in a sense, even if it's not what he wants or what he's seeking. And how Tarkovsky deconstructs that over the course of the film, I think is really great, especially given how it ends, which is intensely bleak. like this is a film that is not for the faint of heart. And I love that Tarkovsky is willing to go there. And I think that darkness gives this film power. I love that he's not willing to hold back. And look, if this is a student film, it has to be the best one ever made.
Yeah.
Because this is a stunning achievement as far as I'm concerned.
Right. No, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think his performance is singular. It's one of the standout of all Tarkovsky's kind of actors, I think, in all of his films. I think what's interesting, well, one of the things that's interesting with Ivan's childhood is that it begins and it kind of sets up this binary between there's 4 dream sequences throughout the film, and the dream sequences are in these idyllic nature settings. His mother is still alive.
Yeah.
And then he wakes up and he's in the war zone, right? But there's all of these echoes by which even the war, even in his dreams, is still there. It's never completely away. And so the first dream begins and there is a cuckoo bird's call. And cuckoo birds have this association in folklore with death, right? With the ticking of the clock, right? The very first shot of the film is he's looking through an empty spider web, which is kind of this ominous image. There's a close-up of a goat, which can be read as a pagan symbol of Satanism, right?
Sure.
So the war, even when he's asleep, the war is still impinging itself on his consciousness, right? And so the binary between war, reality bad, childhood, and then the dream of peacefulness that he can escape that, it's not as clear cut as I think sometimes people assume it is on first viewing. They're in an interaction with one another. And the thing about the surrogate father that you were mentioning is this is a bit biographical, but Tarkovsky's father abandoned his family when Tarkovsky was a young child. And Tarkovsky left his he had 2 children and a wife, and Tarkovsky's father left his family to pursue life with another woman. And Tarkovsky felt like that abandonment was the singular loss that he never really got over. And his father became a famous Soviet poet. So his father also became, in his own way, a very renowned artist in the Soviet period. And so Tarkovsky, through his films, and this is kind of a psychoanalytic, almost Freudian kind of angle to some of his stuff, but his characters are always on the search for father figures or becoming surrogate father figures themselves. And that was something that Tarkovsky himself was after and searching for in his life. And interestingly enough, when later in his life, Tarkovsky would abandon his first wife and child to pursue a life with another woman. And so he recreates the act of paternal desertion. And so I guess I mentioned that because the biographical from the fictional or the cinematic is never far removed. Tarkovsky's films are a way he works out a lot of what he's going through in his life.
Yeah, and I do remember talking about that a little bit in our Tarkovsky series because I believe The Mirror is a little semi-biographical as well. But those ideas do come through in some of his others that we'll get to. And there's something about channeling that through the lens of this adolescent that I just find so devastating. Especially because of the circumstances around him that he really has no control over, that he's forced into. That's something that subjectively just really resonates with me deeply. And for context, Raymond, I'm a very emotional person. I wear my emotions on my sleeves. So given his entire filmography, there's really no surprise that this is the one that I feel like delves into that space the most, which is why I think I love it so much. And again, the craft is very much there. I love how this film is shot. I love its bleakness. I love the performances at the center of it. And while I wasn't wholly aware of all of those nuances you're talking about, that to me only amplifies my love for this movie. And not just the, like, him searching for something through his art, but how it also reflects the irony of his own choices as it relates to his father, and I guess, all pun intended, mirroring his father as well.
There's I mean, the motif of the child in the wake of World War II is a big theme in Italian neorealism.
Yes, absolutely.
Thinking of the film Germany Year Zero by Rossellini, and then The Bicycle Thieves.
Yeah,
and so, like, right? The child becomes a cipher by which to reflect on the injustices of war. And Tarkovsky, I think he obviously, I think, believes in that theme, but he also wants to be included in that conversation. He wants to be included in the generation of filmmakers that are rethinking war and kind of the new aesthetics to do it. And so he uses this somewhat strategically as well. I don't think it takes away from the emotional impact of it all, but he wants to be in the same conversation that the other great Italian and French filmmakers are in.
Yeah, and you noted earlier that this film came out during the fallout of Stalin, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And this is a film that, in many respects, is depicting the fallout of a generation lost
Yes.
to his choices.
Yes.
So as intimate as it is on an individual scale, there's a broader scope to it that I think adds to that devastation.
Absolutely. And there's something that, in fact, you can almost, it's almost the Stalinist holdover in the film, is that it's incredibly anti-German, the film, right?
Yes.
So a big theme in Stalinist war films, while Stalin is still alive. So the war ends in 1945. Stalin dies in 1943, in 1953. I'm sorry. And so there's 8 years of movie making that happens before Stalin dies, and then he dies, and Tarkovsky starts making movies. But a big theme is this carrying this historical rancor towards Germany and Germans. And so in Ivan's childhood, there's one famous scene where he's looking through a book of a German artist printouts from the 15th century, Albert Dürer. And he sees a cutout of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And he says, oh, those look like the Fritzes on motorcycles who took my village and killed my mother, right? And he's talking about the biblical representations of pestilence, war, famine, and death, right? And so the film is still shot through with this kind of Soviet anti-German propaganda that is probably the most pronounced in this film. Tarkovsky kind of moves away from that as he matures as a director, but the film is still Soviet in some respects, even though it feels like it has nothing to do with kind of the boringness and the propaganda of Soviet culture. But there are elements of it that are there.
Well, and I think the interesting thing too about, and maybe this can be said about a lot of movies like this, but sadly, because of the world we live in, this is like, there is a broad appeal to this movie despite its specificities, because this is something we still see all the time.
Yes.
And so I think there's this long lasting legacy to this film that like the truth at the center of it will always stay intact. Regardless, because unless the world around us decides to change, I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. I have yet to see any shred of truth to that, but that certainly makes the reality of this film, I think, all the more grim and impactful. So, and obviously, I think that was probably part of his commentary here.
Completely.
Because I mean, war is.
Right.
It's never ending.
I mean,
before and after Tarkovsky.
The film takes place on the Black Sea in Ukraine, right? The film takes place at a theater of war today. That's happening.
There you go. Exactly.
And so watching this film, I mean, and the situation today, and again, we could maybe talk about this at the very end when we look back at him as a director. But watching this film today, in light of what's going on in Ukraine, I think you're forced to watch it a little bit differently.
Yep, that is a very astute observation. All right, let's move on to 1966. Let's talk about Andrei Rublev.
Okay.
What do you think of this one?
Okay, so again, the touch of context is there's a great Soviet film that comes out that's called Ivan the Terrible, and it's two parts by Sergei Eisenstein, which is a medieval epic about Russia in its earliest formation, right? The first Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. And Tarkovsky hates Eisenstein, right? Eisenstein is everything that Tarkovsky does not want to be. Eisenstein's too political, he's too propagandistic, he's didactic, he's too esoteric with how he uses montage. And so Tarkovsky wants to make a medieval epic to kind of supplant the place of Ivan the Terrible in Soviet culture. He wants to outdo Eisenstein's masterpiece through Andrei Rublev, right? So he's sort of Ivan the Terrible was filmed in the early 40s, so 25 years later or so, he makes Andrei Rublev's to kind of he wants to claim the mantle of having a filmic legacy to Russia's history. So that's just a bit of context, I guess. And then Andrei Rublev is actually what really got me thinking about Andrei Tarkovsky, because there are two versions of Andrei Rublev that are circulating in the world. There's a 183-minute version, and there's a 203-minute version. The 183-minute version is a result of after he submitted the film to the Soviets controlled all the major cultural industries. And so he submitted it to censors. They watched it all and they said, this is too violent. You have to pare down X, Y, and Z. Tarkovsky said that he's not going to do that under any circumstances, but he eventually relented because he wanted the film to come out, even though it eventually didn't. But he cut it down a bit. And so we're given the 183-minute, the slightly cut down version. In the version that is not cut down, or is more graphic footage about, especially during the battle scenes in that film. And they're already pretty graphic as is. It's another war film in a way. But one of the images that he takes out of the film is an image of a cow that is on fire. That in a barn, they shot a cow that they presumably had lit on fire. They said that they put it in asbestos beforehand, so the cow was unharmed, but we don't know what really happened. But in the director's cut, there is an image of a burning cow, right? And I was completely overwhelmed by how that could have been included or happened, or the ethics of deciding to do that, right?
Sure.
So that was probably the first image that I encountered where I was, I mean, for all the things that I love about Tarkovsky, this made me think about a kind of ruthlessness and a kind of unethicalness that went into making some of his films. And this got me thinking about, how do I begin to make sense of the motivation of a director who wanted to film a cow lit on fire?
Yeah, I think that's very fair and certainly a lot to parse there. I really like this film a lot. And I think what is so magical about it to me, among many things, I mean, you're talking about some of the brutality of it and the choices he makes as a filmmaker. And honestly, I don't recall which version of this I saw.
They're both long.
Yeah, they're both long. Either way, I do remember the film being quite long and extensive. However, I do remember liking what this film is at its core, and we don't have enough time to really parse through it all. So I guess to boil down what I love so much about this film is what Tarkovsky is doing in terms of its dualities, because this is a movie where it gets to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that when it comes to scope, when we're talking about what the film's ethos is, a lot of the times films have to choose. Are you going to be this grandiose, epic period piece, or are you going to be an intimate, raw, truthful character study?
Right.
A lot of films don't get to do both. Some do, a lot don't. And this is certainly one of those rare exemptions where it is able to be this fascinating character study while also depicting this period of Russia and giving us a lot more broader context as to what's happening at that time. That in and of itself, I think, is impressive from a storytelling and a filmmaking perspective. But he deconstructs that further as the film goes. And I think where it ultimately lands is that, through the series of events that we see here, a lot of it begins to contrast what Rublev's own morals are.
Mhm.
And I love that the idea of juxtaposing that in and of itself is fascinating. But what it ultimately depicts is Rublev's torment at the raw truth of the world that he sees around him, how that begins to tear him apart. So you get the personal scope while it simultaneously spotlights the endless corruption that permeates 15th century Russia on a general scope. Those dualities, it takes a special filmmaker to be able to pull that off. And not only do I think Tarkovsky does that, but he does it in spellbinding fashion. This is a movie that could only exist in the hands of Tarkovsky. I don't think anyone else could have even attempted to make this, especially the way he did it.
Right. No, I think that hits the nail on the head. And Tarkovsky wants to identify, right, his story with Andrei Rublev's story, right? He sees Andrei Rublev living in a world that doesn't largely appreciate his talent, right? That's corrupt, that's incredibly violent, that's politically fractious. But nonetheless, Rublev kind of rises above the fray and makes great art in spite of it all. And Tarkovsky, working in the Soviet Union, right? He's already running into pressures of censors. They're starting to ban films, right? There's a kind of political shift that happens in the late 60s. That's kind of people call it this sort of neo-Stalinist moment where the kind of authoritarian system comes back, or like retightens the screws. And so Tarkovsky sees himself as a similar artist working against these enormous headwinds that still is generating great art in spite of it all and not losing faith in the kind of enduring creative spirit of the human maker, right? And then the beginning episode with the man on the balloon who sort of a depiction of a medieval balloonist, right? It's very, very unexpected. You would not think that's how this begins with an image of flight, right? He's like a medieval pilot, right?
Yeah.
And a popular way to interpret that image is that, right, this is this guy who has a dream that's enchanted humankind for centuries about flight and aviation, right? The Wright brothers in the early 20th century. He achieves it. His balloon crashes. It doesn't work out well for him, but nonetheless, he momentarily stepped into this transcendent vision of imagination and creativity, and then he falls back to earth. And that's sort of the point of it all, right? Tarkovsky wants to kind of transcend, fly above the political and social realities of what he's working with to make something great, right? And then at the end of the film, you see the great bell. And the same thing, the same motif is sustained, right? Despite everything, the bleakness of this world, still beauty and grace and all of this can still shine through.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do love how he's able to emulate all of that. You noted this in our discussion there of Ivan's childhood. It's very prominent in this film as well as the others we'll talk about. But his use of symbolism is, I think what I love about Tarkovsky is that it is prominent throughout. It's very much in this film in a lot of ways. I kind of love that sometimes it's not very subtle.
Right.
Because, these films are so dense and some of them are very long that to me, there's an engaging factor to it that while there is certainly a vagueness to a lot of the themes and even the symbols he proposes that, people like yourself can write essays and essays on that I certainly don't have the time, but I would love to consume and read. But sometimes they're very obvious and they're very on the nose. And I think that at times you get that here. But at the same time, I think it all tailors back to the bleakness of it, what he's trying to say with this character and how it tethers to those dualities. I just think it's utterly fascinating. And the cinematography here, this might be my favorite of his from a cinematography perspective. Although, I don't know, Stalker's pretty great.
Yeah.
As soon as I said the sentence out loud, I'm like, I might take that back, maybe. But either way, it's very much of the conversation. Like, this is such a beautiful film just to watch.
Right.
Like the craft of it is astounding.
Mhm. So right, so with symbols, right? Is so interesting. Whenever Tarkovsky was asked about symbols, he would say, "My films have no symbols." He was insistent that there were no symbols in his film, right? Which is an insane, which is an
Andre, come on now.
I know, it's an insane thing to say, right?
Yeah,
But I think so right. How I read that when he says that, I actually think what he's doing is he's baiting us to find right. Told there's no symbols in his films, we want to find symbols all the more, right? So it's almost
sure.
incentivizing
Hey, that's
our
fair. I
impulses.
could buy that. Yeah.
But then it's also okay. So because there's clearly symbols, but he chooses for his symbols fire, clocks, water, wind, right? Like he
Mhm.
chooses these symbols that mean that have endless histories of meaning behind them, right?
Yeah, sure.
So the symbols that he invites, it's not as if it's this one-to-one relationship where X symbolizes Y, right? It's that water symbolizes passage, symbolizes movement, symbolizes death, symbolizes baptism,
Mhm.
symbolizes drowning, symbolizes expanse, right? I mean, the water is so, like multi-meaningful, right? So he loads his films with all of these things, and they're almost exploding with meaning. They're almost these Pandora's box of interpretive possibilities, right? And
Yeah.
and that's what I think he wants. I think he wants to have these be endlessly open-ended.
Yeah. And I do love because
Right,
there's
right.
so much conversation to be had, interpretation to be had, and that's a lot of the fun when
Yeah,
having a
exactly.
Tarkovsky conversation for
Exactly.
sure. Do you
Exactly.
have a favorite segment in this film?
In That's a good question. I love the final image. I mean, I like the very beginning image of the balloon flight.
Yeah, the
I like that
balloon.
very
Yeah,
much.
that's great.
Um,
Yeah.
in part, I like that so much because I think what Tarkovsky is also doing is I'm very much into film history, and
Okay.
Tarkovsky also is very steeped in film history, and so and we forget this, but the Wright brothers coincided with the development of cinema. So cinema sort of enters onto the scene in 1896, the very late 19th century, and the Wright brothers achieve their flight, in 1906, 1907, and the first aerial shot is actually done in a plane that's manned by Wilbur Wright, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so so the balloon that Tarkovsky is showing with Efim, the character's name, who ends up mistakenly on the balloon, is that he's kind of recreating this originary moment of cinema that the history of motion pictures coincides with the history of human flight, right?
Mhm.
And so there's this meta kind of reflection on the history of cinema that I like very much in the beginning, and then towards the end, I love the final image of the that goes to color, right? So there's a
Yeah.
final
Yeah.
sequence that shows the Rublov's artwork, and it's these lush reds and greens, and then the final shot of the film is four horses in the rain, in color, and the camera's very distant, and it holds its focus on them for about a minute just as they graze in the rainfall, right?
Yeah.
And it's a moment of it's almost like a reward for having endured the grittiness and the coarseness and the
Yes, sir.
violence of this film for 3 hours,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
But again, if you think about it from the perspective of film history, it also reminds me of the scene from The Wizard of Oz with the horses
Sure.
that never come,
Yeah.
right? Is that
Yeah.
in the very beginning of The Wizard of Oz, you see horses in black and white and sepia when the tornado rips through
Yep.
Kansas. And then
Yep.
Dorothy goes to the Emerald City and she gets on the carriage. And the
Yep.
first thing she says is, "What kind of horse is that?" And the camera pans to a purple horse. And so again,
Uh-huh.
Tarkovsky is sort of reflecting on the moment that color arrives to cinema with The Wizard of Oz, which is the first color film. We get horses again, right?
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
uses that in Andrei Rublev. And so Andrei Rublev, as much as it's a meditation on the history of Russia, it's also a meditation on the history of cinema.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about the film from that perspective before, but that is a fascinating idea. And I'm really interested to go and rewatch this movie just to watch it from that lens.
Yeah, yeah.
I think would be fascinating. But yeah, I mean, it's a gorgeous film to look at, and I love its dualities. It is brutal, but I love how Tarkovsky gets to have his cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
For the sake of, because right now we're on pace for this to be about 2.5 hours.
I know.
So, which is great. I'm loving this. But let's talk about Solaris, 1972. Where do you sit on this one?
So Solaris is made in direct response to Stanley Kubrick's 1968 Space Odyssey,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, of course.
2001 that comes out
Yeah,
next
yeah, yeah,
year, right? Solaris is 1972. And Tarkovsky does not like Kubrick's Space Odyssey. And I've always said Tarkovsky is sort of the Soviet Kubrick. That's sort of something that I've been
That's a fair statement. Yeah.
They each have a war film. Barry Lyndon's the costume drama.
Yeah.
No,
Exactly. You can't help but think of it. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So Tarkovsky is very critical of the space race, is critical of the propaganda that's the Soviets are generating, that the Americans are generating about going into the cosmos, colonizing the moon. Kubrick he sees as and I think he misreads Kubrick. I think Kubrick's much more ambivalent, but nonetheless, he thinks Kubrick is sort of buying in to this cult of space that's happening in the 1960s and 70s. And so Tarkovsky wants to make an outer space film that he says is about inner space. Right. So this is a film about the emotional state of its protagonist. He brings his home movies with him onto the spaceship. Right. The whole thing is about this kind of psychic drama with the ghost of his reanimated ex-wife. And so Tarkovsky is not interested in outer space. He's interested in inner space. Right. And so spaceship is very claustrophobic. There's several close-ups of the protagonist's ear. And as the ear being like the canal that goes into the body, right? So Tarkovsky, he says, we don't know ourselves. So why are we wasting our time going to the moon, right? And so Solaris is kind of his, it's a film about the human mind. It's not really, it's a red herring to think it's a film about outer space.
Yeah, I agree. That to me is what I love so much about this film. Now, playing my own cards here once again, because I noted this to you earlier. Our listeners very much know this. I wear my emotions on my sleeve. So imagine how I responded to this movie. And I think that sleight of hand that you're talking about is what I love so much about Solaris, because it is this movie where these characters go to outer space. And what that evokes is this sensation of exploration, our place in the universe, and perhaps it can come with this feeling of grandiose curiosity and the largeness of the universe. However, Tarkovsky, as you noted, is not interested in that at all. He very much subverts that feeling. And I do think that 2001 does a great job of tapping into the cosmos in that regard. Although I do think 2001 in a similar way also gets to these existential ideas on humanity in a very different way, obviously. But I do love what Solaris is doing in terms of subverting that grandiosity to channel something so deeply personal and so deeply intimate, tapping into this question of, what would you do if you had the opportunity to be with someone that you had loved and lost,
right?
Even if it was just a manifestation, even if it wasn't real, but you still got that second opportunity. How would you react to it? That to me is so profoundly moving in this film. And I do love how Chris reacts to it, right? Because at first it is very jarring. Like the first time he sees his wife, he takes her and shoots her off into space. I love that there's almost this trepidation or fear or there's something instinctual that is jarring, but eventually he succumbs to it because of the heartache that he's feeling, the guilt that he might be feeling. And he allows himself to really wrestle with that question and embrace this opportunity that I think is just so fascinating, because it's a thought exercise that surely everyone has had, when dealing with grief. And he explores that through this facade of space in a way that I just find so immensely provocative. Now, at times, it's in some ways it's hard for me to talk about this without also thinking of Soderbergh. But I do, because I say that because Soderbergh, like the third act of Soderbergh Solaris, has more of a tender warmth to it. Where
I have yet to see that film. I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It is in my top 5 for 2002, I believe, is when that film came out, and it's one of my favorite Soderbergh films. And what I love about Soderbergh is that he channels the central ethos of it, but he does enough to distinct itself and kind of make it his own. So to me, it's also very Soderberghian, if I can call it that. Because the third act, especially like the endings of the two films are actually quite different in a lot of ways, especially emotionally, because Tarkovsky is Tarkovsky and he wants to be a little bit more vague. It's a little bit more cold, I guess, is how I would articulate it. But I don't say that as a bad thing. I just it's just the way Tarkovsky loves to present his material. Yeah. And I love that. I love that vagueness. I love that he doesn't want to spoon feed the audience anything. And it's of course methodical, it's thoughtful, it's everything that comes with Tarkovsky. And I love how that sleight of hand you talked about, I think is what makes this one of my favorite films ever made.
And Solaris is also the film where Tarkovsky, I think, declares this commitment to world culture. And when I say that, I mean there's images of Don Quixote, the book. There are pictures of European paintings, right? There's a bust of Socrates at one point in the film. We hear the music of Bach, right? So this is his film. He's Andrei Rublev is about medieval Russia. Ivan's Childhood is about Russia in World War II, right?
Yep.
Solaris is where he goes, he looks beyond his background. He looks beyond his subject position into the repository of world culture and how he can draw on all of this in his creative practice.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because there's no geographical boundaries in space.
No. Exactly. Right.
Like
exactly.
We're all the same once you move into the upper atmosphere.
Yes. Right.
And I think embracing broad humanity in that regard, it does have a more universality to it all. But I love, and again, I think that's why emphasizing the intimate is the right way to examine this material, because again, that's something everyone can relate with. Grief is something we all will go through, and we will all probably have this thought exercise at some point or another, especially when you're riddled with guilt, or maybe there's something you would love to say to the person one more time, or you'd love to have a conversation about, one thing or another. And seeing how that comes through here is just, I just find mesmerizing. I absolutely love it.
And then the film begins on Earth, and it's an extraterrestrial film that's really advocating for the terrestrial, right? The most peaceful moments are in the beginning, the first 40 minutes of the film, when Kelvin is on Earth and he's looking at the river and he's walking through his estate. He sees a horse run by on the screen, right? This film is really calling Kelvin back to Earth. It's saying that you're missing the point by going into outer space.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Only for the film to end in a way.
Yeah. It's probably his most confusing ending, actually.
It is a little confounding, but I do think there's enough there. I don't know. Maybe I'm mislead. I don't want to mislead anyone, because I still think there's room for interpretation, but I don't know. I was going to say, I think there's enough clues that it does evoke an irony as it relates to what you're saying there. But I think that's purposeful. I love that irony, if that's really what Tarkovsky was going for there. So, okay. Then we get to Mirror in 1975. Unless there's anything else you want to say.
No. Mirror. We can go to Mirror.
Yeah. What do you think of Mirror?
Mirror. So Mirror is it's certainly his most explicitly autobiographical, right? It's sort of this
Yeah.
mirror image of him, right? And
Hmm.
he's very interested in Mirror about how the everything that you've been talking about, this sort of the deeply personal, right?
Hmm.
These moments that you would only have had, you could have only lived through to remember, right? So there's
Hmm.
this moment in the beginning of the film where a neighbor's barn lights on fire, and the child who's then grows up in the film but goes out to watch it, right? There's a moment about their pet dog, right?
Hmm.
And how these tiny human moments, these seemingly insignificant details of our lives, how they unfold against these huge macro events of history, right? So he's showing these tiny, intimate, familial moments, and then he transitions to images of the Spanish Civil War, which is a huge thing for Soviet culture because it was all about the fight between communism and fascism. He shows images of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He shows images of the Great Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s, right? And so he's interested in how these huge events of history that are somehow happening somewhere out there, right, can still nevertheless impact you all the way down here, right, on this
Sure.
micro level of human interaction, and that kind of dance between the macro historical and the micro personal is what he's interested in Mirror. With how the individual gets caught up in history, in other words.
Yeah. I think that's why this film is so interesting. I will admit this is one of those movies I'm still wrestling with. I would love to give this one
Yeah.
another watch sometime soon because at least my recollection of it, again, it's been a few years since I've seen these movies, but this is a movie that, because it's as you talked about it, explicitly biographical for him, and it's told from the perspective of a man who's dying, and we see how his memories have shaped him and his relationships with his family. I do love how that in itself evokes a broad, I guess, idea that a lot of us can relate with, even if the images themselves, where the story goes, these characters are so explicit and specific to either Tarkovsky himself or Russian history. There were times with this film that I felt a little distant from it as a result, but I
Mhm,
think its central nucleus,
mhm,
as it relates to, again, the existential crisis that is at the center of this film, that to me I did find relatable enough
mhm,
that I could put myself into that place of looking back at my life, reflecting on my memories, and
mhm,
how that taps into the relationships in my lives,
mhm.
or in my life. I feel like I was able to walk away from this experience and still have something shared with
Mhm.
Tarkovsky in that regard, even if our specific lives are so vastly different, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, it does, it does, it does.
Yeah.
Right, well, and I mean, I think that's the film's an invitation to do just that. The film is an invitation to think
Hmm.
about your own life and how memory, right? When we remember our own
Yeah.
lives, he gives us that idea of a mirror, but we remember our lives almost these shattered mirrors, right? It's these
Yeah.
shards and fragments of these historical events that impact us, what we remember, what we don't remember, who we remember, how we remember, and we kind of restitch that together in a very messy, jumbled picture. We don't remember things linearly, right?
Yeah.
And that's why
Yes.
this film is so fragmented, right? And
Yeah, and I do love that. I love how the narrative here is purposefully disjointed
yes,
and
yeah,
vague and all over the place structurally
yes,
speaking,
yes,
because
yes.
that's how memories work, right?
Exactly,
And
exactly.
so I do love how he's able to tap into that. Yeah.
And the central female actor in the film plays both his mother in the periods in the film set in the 1930s and 1940s, but also his wife in the period set in the 1970s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even that is, again, what we talked about with Ivan's childhood, this kind of Freudian psychoanalytic dimension to his work, is that this conflation of a man's relationship to his mother and his wife. So
Mm-hmm.
he's interested in these questions. He and also
Yeah.
invites these psychoanalytic readings.
Absolutely. And I do love how he's able to evoke that again, even if at times it's a little jumbled, but I do love that he wants to, he does want to have these thoughtful conversations. And as you're talking about, I do think it is an invitation. And it's, again, the craft of it is so good, you can't help but be engaged by it. So, like my distancing of it really has nothing to do with how it's made or even what it is at its core, as much as it is. There's a specificity to it that I have to kind of maneuver around to find that relatability, but I do think it's there.
Sure.
I do really like the film. Not my favorite of his.
Yeah,
I do really like it.
Right. I mean, it's sort of when I show that in class with my students, most of my students have never seen anything like it, right? And I said this is sort of a capital A art film. This is the definitional art film, right? It's non-linear, classical music. You have no idea what's going on, right? It's that when we think of the art house, we think of films like Mirror.
Yeah. Absolutely. And perhaps Stalker as well. Should we talk about that?
Yes.
So Stalker 1979, I think there's an argument to be made that it's
my favorite.
I was going to say this might be the one that people talk about the most, or they have it at the top of their list most often. It might be his most popular, if you want to classify it that way.
I think Stalker is a masterpiece, and I think so precisely because it is to me it is the zone is the most open-ended space in all movies, right? And there's so many ways by which you can read the zone and try to make sense of it, and they all fit, right? One person's interpretation of the zone doesn't crowd out another, right? So is the zone, as some people say, right, like this kind of premonition of Chernobyl? It's this nuclear radioactive wasteland.
Yep.
It could very well be that, right? Is the zone the kind of like, the spiritual place that you could find on Earth, but there is really a wish room at its center where everybody who goes in, their deepest, darkest wish will be fulfilled, right? Other people read the zone as the desire for desire, right? The hope that there's something more to life, right? Even or faith or religion, right? People read it like that. Other people read the zone, an interpretation that I'm very open to, is that the zone is actually, again, kind of like cinema, right? It's a place of fantasy. It's a place of wish fulfillment. It also does the same relationship with color, is that the film is in sepia, and when they enter the zone, it bursts into color like Dorothy.
Love that.
Oz, right? So the zone is sort of our experience when we go see a movie. We go into a zone, right? The zone is a dream. I don't know. It's a limitless with how you can think about it, and I think that's why I like it so much, because it people watch this movie and they're searching for an answer, right?
Yeah.
Just the characters are,
but
it gives no answer.
and that's what I love about the movie. And admittedly, and I want to throw this out as a caveat, I will explain why, because I know that there might be some pushback here. I do find that slightly frustrating at times. It's what keeps it from being perhaps my favorite Tarkovsky, but I do agree this is a really great movie. And I haven't done a Tarkovsky ranking in a long time. This would probably be number 3 for me, behind Solaris and Ivan's Childhood. But I do love this film, and honestly, regardless of ranking and how I feel about it on the whole, as far as reviews we've done on this podcast, and at this point, we're close to 11 years. And this is probably top 10 for me as far as review conversations we've had on the show. I loved talking about this film. And a lot of it has to do with the ambiguity that you're talking about. There are endless interpretations to be had. And we did talk about how this could be viewed as, repercussions of nuclear fallout. That was something that Brendan certainly wanted to get into. And, I think for me, there's perhaps this facade of the film regarding its potential sci-fi elements, or however you want to articulate this zone that Tarkovsky creates here, regardless. But I think it for me, and you were kind of getting into it, it really is more of a film about symbols and faith and people getting lost in these ideas of wanting to seek riches. But at the heart of humanity, it's about you and what you do to make your life rich, not what an outside source is going to give you. I love that thesis. And I love that Tarkovsky creates an atmosphere that does give stakes to the film with that specifically. So regardless of my frustrations, I think there's so much to be taken away with this film in that regard, and the conversation is just arresting, I think, when it comes to this film.
I think one of the hardest things that filmmakers can do, and there's really not many films that I think do it, but it's this question of atmosphere, right? And so when people, my students have this experience, I had this experience. It sounded like you did when you watched this film, is that people feel spellbound in a way by this film that they don't by others. And how is atmosphere created? There's not one. It's there's no formula, right? It's the use of light. It's the use of camera. It's sort of this worry or even anxiety that there are other things happening beyond the frame that you don't know what's there, but you can feel them kind of exerting a pressure. I feel whenever I watch this film, I feel completely absorbed by this atmospheric quality to it. And it's very ineffable. And of all of his films, I mean, he's a very atmospheric filmmaker, but I feel like Stalker to me is the most, I don't know, it's the atmosphere where you could sort of imbibe. It's like this heavy kind of almost humidity that washes over you.
Yeah, I do feel the film is very immersive in that regard, for sure. Really, I guess my only reservation, it circles around to the film's existentialism in some ways, because this is a film asking a lot of profound questions around humanity and hopelessness and symbols, our place in the universe. Some of it, for me, and I noted this earlier, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but some of it is a little on the nose because there are times where this film will pause just so characters can ask those questions flat out, which he doesn't. Like in Solaris, there's never a moment where the film pauses for a character to just almost look in the camera and go, now, how would you react to this situation?
Right.
This film kind of does that, where these characters, they're on their way to the zone and they will just, without subtlety, ask the questions that is on Tarkovsky's mind. And the way that is laid out at times, I guess I just don't know, because I think of that moment where it's kind of this fun irony, but there's this moment where these characters pose some of these deeply thoughtful questions, but they're doing this as they're going to bed. As if it's like an afterthought. And if it was me, I'm like, those questions don't put me to sleep. I'm so like, I have to have a conversation about this. Like some of the, and maybe that's just the differences between Tarkovsky and myself, which is fair. It's probably just subjective for me. But I, like you and I, like, sure, we can sit here for another 3 hours and talk about the questions and how we feel about our place in the universe. I'm not going to do that though, as I'm going to bed. You know what I mean? So like, it's, there's a few things like that where because it's like, okay, he wants to create this element where he can pose these questions, and so the setup of the film, I guess, the vehicle to get us there, I don't know if that's fully developed, because he clearly didn't care about that as much as he wanted to get into these questions. And it's in that where this film, to your point, is extremely masterful. And so even if it's a little on the nose, I still find it immersive. I still find myself engrossed by how he goes there. And I noted earlier the cinematography, if it's not Andrei Rublev, it is definitely this film because of the singular images. Even if you've never seen this film, I can virtually guarantee you've seen a frame of it. It has some of the most iconic images ever. It's so incredible. And you talked about the color palette, like you get these brown and yellow and darker hues at the beginning of the film, and then transitions to these more brighter hues once they get to, or on their way to the zone. Like those transitions here are it's incredible. So like my nitpicks are, in the grand scheme,
Right.
is that they're nitpicks.
Right.
That's
No,
all they are.
I just right, and I think what he would say, or maybe what I think he would, is that the quality of being on the nose is actually something that he wanted to do here. So I know exactly.
And that's fair. Very fair. Yeah.
You know exactly the moment you're talking about before they go to sleep, and they're really just pretty much directly asking, what is the meaning of life, right?
Yeah.
And then the camera cuts, and there's a reading from the book of Revelation, right, in the Bible, at the end of the world. And the camera scans over a river, and within the river, you see religious artwork, you see a syringe, you see a gun, you see money, right? And so you have war, health, drugs.
Yeah, it's not subtle
Religion.
at all.
It's not subtle. But I think what he's almost doing is that, like, the semantic weight of all of this, right? It almost collapses. These things become so profound that it almost collapses in on you, and you're left in that sense of disorientation, right? So I feel like he's interested in laying it on super thick, where you can't, you fall under the weight of it.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I haven't wrestled with the film in quite a few years, but now that we're talking about it out loud, I do think there's perhaps some truth to it, all joking aside, or perhaps with all of the joking. Because I think there is an element that a lot of us do go to bed, though, thinking about those things.
Yeah.
And maybe when we are experiencing something that is so raw and intimate, such as grief, like we see in Solaris, for example, or you think about reflecting on your life, as we see in Mirror, or perhaps you're in the middle of some sort of chaos, as we see in Ivan's Childhood, it would be impossible in those situations to go to bed and not think about your place in the world, and to not think about your life in some sort of profound way. So I joke and I find it fun and ironic, but perhaps to Tarkovsky's point, maybe that is not that those characters are experiencing that, because they're not. But if I extract the idea and place it amongst his other work and how that channels to our own lives, I think there actually is something to that.
Yeah. And I mean, so the way a lot of Western audiences read The Zone is that it's about nuclear waste site, or it's a premonition of Chernobyl. But for Soviet audience, I mean, Chernobyl hasn't happened yet. Chernobyl's
that was another 7 years or something to that?
Exactly, 6 years,
6 years, yeah.
So, but for Soviet viewers, for Russian viewers of the time, what's the Zone? It's an abandoned Stalinist prison camp, right? The Zona in Russian was a word that used to mean gulag, right?
Yeah.
In slang. And Stalker has a shaved head. He looks like a prison inmate, right? And so for contemporaneous viewers, the Zone is a site of historical trauma, right? And going back into a space like that, right, where those questions about, like, what is faith? What is the meaning of life? What is the nature of suffering? That is a site where those questions would be asked, right?
Yeah. And I think that idea of faith, especially looking at it through a Western lens, is really fascinating to me, because you can look at the ideas here, as it relates to desires, what's bubbling underneath the surface, how different our desires can, how that can vary from how we perceive the world. When it comes to something like God or hope, or maybe more broadly speaking, just our place in the universe, I think there can be this vivid epiphany that many of us have when it comes to reality, because those things at times can come with this giant chasm. And how are you supposed to react when, again, those perceptions are not what you think they're? You're not getting back the what you think you were going to, right?
Right.
As it relates to your desires. So then it kind of comes down to this idea of, again, what you desire, you might have to go out and get yourself. It's not always going to be something that's handed to you, and whatever that may be. And that's the great thing about the zone, is that it can symbolize God, it can symbolize different types of gods or whatever, as far as you going out and trying to ask it to give you something. But the reality is that's not always going to be the case. And how do you react to that? I mean, that to me, I think is really provocative here.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else on Stalker?
I think
good movie.
Good movie, very good. I mean, the ending is also another extremely confusing ending.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for the sake of time, probably.
Yes. Very Tarkovsky like.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so these last two, for transparency's sake, I have not seen. I have not seen Nostalgia. I have not seen The Sacrifice, both 1983 and 1986 respectively. So why don't you take the reins here? Tell me about those two films, any historical context you want to bring to them.
Sure.
What do you think of those movies?
So interestingly, these are both films made by Tarkovsky, who was working in the Soviet Union, and they're not filmed in Russia. He leaves Russia. He begins going back and forth. He wants to make a film in Italy, and he begins going back and forth from the Soviet Union to Italy to do work on this film, beginning in 1979. And then he, in the early 80s, goes back to film. By 83, he's still in Italy. The movie has just come out, and the Soviets say that they're not going to extend his work abroad visa or permit or whatever. And so what that means is that he knows that if he goes back to the Soviet Union, he's not going to be let back out, right? And so he announces that he's not going to go back, which is sort of the self-imposed exile. And he then spends the rest of his life. He dies in 1986, so 3 years after Nostalgia comes out. And so he spends the rest of his life abroad in Europe, moving around from Italy, France, and Sweden mostly, which is where The Sacrifice is filmed, right?
Okay. Yep.
So Nostalgia, in short, is again very autobiographical. It is about, surprise, a Russian emigre who goes to Italy to work on a research project, but he completely finds himself adrift and missing home and missing his family and alienated and unable to connect with the world around him. He knows Italian, kind of, he knows Italian enough to get by, but not that well enough. He has to go around with a translator. And the film is very deliberately called Nostalgia, not nostalgia. So Tarkovsky is sort of incorporating that mistranslation into the title. So a mistranslation of cultural experience, a mistranslation of language, a mistranslation of history, right?
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yes, and so it's very, very atmospheric, intense fogs, and lots of deep reflections on sort of the nature of life, and culminates in a very, very dramatic act that consists of a kind of an Italian madman who gets the ear of the protagonist that's thinking that the world is about to end, and he lights himself on fire. And dies because as a protest against the modern world, and that him lighting himself on fire resonates with the South Vietnamese monk who I forget his name, but who lit himself on fire in protest of foreign involvement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Early 1960s, right?
Yeah.
And which footage of that is also incorporated into Mirror, actually, as well. So again, it's sort of this creating. Tarkovsky's now at the point where he's using his films to write the autobiography of his life, but also the autobiography of his films. Right? He knows he's sick. He knows his health is in decline, and so he uses these last two films to reflect on his life, but also on the 5 films that he made previously. So that's kind of Nostalgia, and then The Sacrifice. And then The Sacrifice takes place in Sweden, and Tarkovsky was a diehard fan of Ingmar Bergman, right?
Yeah, who isn't?
And I'm a big fan of Bergman too, right? And and you can see, I mean, you watch Bergman, and there's so many similarities between Tarkovsky. There's
for
very
sure
interesting use of sound. They take place in these isolated, regions of these nature preserves, and there's fog and rain and water, and they have these philosophical conversations, and there's classical music,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep.
And I'm thinking in particular, if you've seen the movie Through a Glass Darkly,
Yes. Yeah.
that's Tarkovsky comes very close to kind of almost recreating that in The Sacrifice. It takes place in Sweden on a nature reserve in this big house where there's just a small family. And what happens is unexpectedly, there is news of an outbreak of nuclear war, right? And so they're literally staring down the end of the world. And the film is about how they grapple with this imminent catastrophe, right? And interestingly, right, the film comes out in May 1986, and then that summer is when Chernobyl happens, right? Which is the worst, right? So the film sort of anticipates, like people think Stalker is the film that forebodes the nuclear catastrophe.
And then there's this one.
It's The Sacrifice that really does it, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is that Swedish authorities were the first people to detect irregular levels of nuclear radiation coming from Soviet airspace, right? And in the movie, Tarkovsky shows us, we hear on television Swedish authorities announcing the outbreak of nuclear war. So it's uncanny how close Tarkovsky actually got to anticipating what was going to happen.
I was gonna say, imagine if it was reversed,
right?
And it came out a few months afterward. People would have lost their minds.
Right.
Yeah.
And so The Sacrifice is it's probably my least favorite of Tarkovsky's films, just because there's a coldness to the film that I think he's kind of channeling this kind of Scandinavian Bergman-esque sort of frigidity, like right to the films. But interestingly, the last shot of The Sacrifice is a reenactment of the first shot of Ivan's childhood.
Oh man.
So
now I have to see the film.
I know, just of that alone. And so you get this, you really do get this sense of that this is a director who had control over, he had a very clear vision of what he wanted his entire body of work.
He knew this was going to be it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's diagnosed with lung cancer while he's working on The Sacrifice, and he does the final edits from his hospital bed. He was going to a clinic in France, outside in a suburb outside Paris. He's so sick that he's not able to attend the Cannes Film Festival in 1986, where The Sacrifice wins. It comes out in 1985, but the Cannes Festival in 86, he's not able to attend, where it wins the grand prize. And then he passes away in December. So really, this is by the time Sacrifice comes out, this is very, very much the end of his life. And he dies from lung cancer, and this will probably never be proven definitively, but there's a lot of rumors that he and also several crew members on Stalker, because they were filming in what was then part of the Soviet Union in Estonia, near an abandoned uranium not manufacturing, but uranium sort of production site. And people think that the chemicals in the air, the levels of toxicity, latent radioactivity, infected several members of the crew. Because he and his wife, and also the actor who plays Andrei Rublev, who's in Stalker as a writer, who's in Solaris as one of the astronauts, he dies of lung cancer, which Tarkovsky also, and his wife also got. And so people think that Stalker actually killed Tarkovsky.
Wow, that's interesting. It's a little John Wayne-esque.
Exactly, yes. But it adds to kind of the mystique and the kind of the haunting nature of all of his work. So that's kind of a snippet of nostalgia in The Sacrifice.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, all you did was provoke me to want to watch these movies. I mean, that sounds so fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
So the trap is to watch these movies, and there's so much that feels so different, in part because of the language, right? Nostalgia is mostly in Italian, and then The Sacrifice is in Swedish, but the the trap is to think that they're different, because there are things that are different, but there's a core of them that really do echo with the rest of what Tarkovsky has been doing.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. I just yeah, I didn't know too much about him, but the autobiographical part of nostalgia, I guess is how you say that.
Yep.
Yeah, that it just sounds so Tarkovsky. I feel like it's been part of the nucleus of this entire conversation. So,
Yes.
and then the almost premonition of
Yes.
sacrifice is so intriguing. Like, yeah, I definitely have. And then the connection to Ivan's childhood. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So I'm definitely gonna go and check
You should.
those out.
I recommend
for
it.
sure.
I recommend it.
Yeah. So once we get through, because right now we're, in the middle of award season, so it's nonstop. But
Right.
once we get through all of that in January, I'm going to make these a priority.
Fabulous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This was a lot of fun.
course.
Really do appreciate you being
course.
here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. As I noted at the beginning of this, for anyone listening in the Kentucky area, these films are playing at the Kentucky Theater. So if you can make it to Lexington, please go and check them out. Are you doing Q&As for all of them or just at the end?
All seven. So at
all
the
seven,
end,
great.
So we watch the film. They usually start about 7:15, 7:30, depending on their length. And then afterwards, they have a little kind of stage area where we have a Q&A. And the one after
Awesome.
Ivan's childhood was spectacular. It was a
Nice.
magical
Very cool.
experience. So I'm hoping to get as many people to come to these as they can.
All right. Very, very cool. Yeah, definitely go and check it out if you have an opportunity to do so. For those of us that don't live in the Lexington area, can we follow you on social media? Are you on social media now?
I actually have almost no social media.
Oh, man.
Unfortunately, I know. It's sort of my last line of defense.
Fair enough.
I would just lose all the free time I don't have, right? All of it more.
I get it. It's a lot, yeah.
But I mean, it's sort of boring. But I have, I easily can be reached by email. If you just Google like Raymond DeLuca, University of Kentucky, something will come up, right? A little profile about me. And I do quite a bit of work on Tarkovsky. I've published some articles on him before. I'm currently in the project in the throes of writing a book on Tarkovsky, and so. The University of Kentucky profile, there's a little way to keep up on kind of the stuff I'm up to if people are interested.
All right, cool. Yeah, and whenever you have anything that comes out, definitely let us know. We'll send out the word. And we can definitely have you back to promote it and talk about it for sure.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this
you.
quite a
Thank
bit.
you.
So yeah, if you're in the Kentucky area, please go and check all of that out. As I noted at the beginning of this, our editor-in-chief, Dave Giannini, a lot of you know him. He's going to be writing about all of these movies. You can check all of that out at insessionfilm.com. And if you do want to hear Brendan and I talk about these films, we did do that Tarkovsky movie series. It was, I think, 2016. So it's been a while, but we had a great time. I noted that our review of Stalker is one of my favorites we've ever done on the show. I definitely hold to that. It's at least for me, it was very rewarding. Hope others will feel the same after going and checking that out. But you can see all of that at insessionfilm.com as well. With that, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. Of course, be sure to subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. Leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of any of Tarkovsky's films. Reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can hit us up or email us, insessionfilm@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your takes if you agree or disagree with anything that Raymond and I had to say here. So with all of that said, thanks once again, Raymond. This was a lot of fun. Really did enjoy it immensely. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast.